Welcome students to my class on condensed matter physics for BSc Physics major students. In my first lecture, the topic will be crystal structure. My topics will cover mainly 3 points: crystal structure, types of solids, unit cells, and besides all these topics, I will also discuss about primitive cell, unit cell, etc. Types of solids. Based on atomic arrangement, solids can be divided into two types. These are crystalline and amorphous. Again, crystalline solids can be distinguished in two ways: single crystal and polycrystal. Types of solids. Crystalline solids. In case of crystalline solids, atoms are arranged in an orderly manner, that is, periodic manner. The atoms are having long range order. For example, of crystalline solids, we can say that iron, copper, and other metals, sodium chloride, etc. On the other hand, amorphous solids, atoms are not present in an orderly manner. They are haphazardly arranged, for example, glass. So the first difference between the crystalline and amorphous solids is that crystalline solids are arranged periodically, but amorphous solids, in case of amorphous solids, atoms are arranged haphazardly. There is no definite periodic order. Crystalline and non-crystalline materials. Crystalline materials, atoms are packed in periodic arrays, 3D arrays, 3D arrays, and a typical example of crystalline materials are metals, mini ceramics, some polymers, etc. On the other hand, non-crystalline materials, atoms have no periodic packing and occurs for nanocrystalline materials. That is, in case of nanocrystalline materials, atoms have no periodic packing. Typical examples are complex structures. After rapid cooling, we can have nanocrystalline materials. In another word, we can say that all amorphous solids are included as nanocrystalline. Some of the important definitions, for example, crystalline material. Crystalline material is a material comprised of one or many crystals. In each crystal, atoms or ions show a long range periodic arrangement. Single crystal. In a single crystal, crystalline materials are made of only one crystal. That is, we do not find any grain boundaries within single crystal. That is, we can also say that in case of single crystals, all the atoms are arranged periodically. Grains are the crystals in a polycrystalline materials. In next slides, we'll discuss about grains along with grain boundaries. Polycrystalline materials is a material comprised of many crystals, as opposed to a single crystal material that has only one crystal. So in case of polycrystalline material, you can find many crystals. So there may be different crystals within grain boundaries. Grain boundaries are regions between grains of a polycrystalline material. Okay. So these are the pictures of single crystal, polycrystal, and amorphous. You see, in the single crystal, periodic arrangement is observed across the whole crystal. In the first figure, we see the periodic arrangement across the whole crystal. In the second picture, the polycrystals. So there are some grains. So grains are here. So within a grain, the atoms are obtained with periodic arrangement. They have some boundaries. The grains may be larger, grains may be smaller. That is, all the grains may not be equal. The last picture you see amorphous, that is not periodic. In case of glass, we can find this type of arrangement of solids, arrangement of atoms. So in case of amorphous materials, we do not find any specific periodic order. Okay. And to understand more clearly, let us see these pictures here. In case of crystalline structure, we find periodic order through whole crystals. In case of amorphous crystal, we find that there is no any specific periodic order. All the atoms or ions are arranged haphazardly. The last one, polycrystalline, you see the boundaries are there. So these are called grain boundaries, and periodicity is maintained within a grain structure. That is, the grains are may not be equal. Some grains are small, some grains are larger. So this picture give more clear idea about crystalline, amorphous, and polycrystalline solids. In the next slide, let us see what is space lattice and also unit cell. In the first picture, we see two-dimensional array of some lattice points. In the second picture, we find some three-dimensional lattice points. A space lattice is simply a set of points, each of which has identical surroundings. Or we can say that a geometric representation of the crystal structure in terms of lattice points is called space lattice, which has the property that the distribution or placement of lattice points that surrounds any given lattice point remains throughout the crystal. That is the unit cell, concept of unit cell here also we find. If we repeat this unit cell throughout the crystal structure, so the crystal is reproduced. So these are the lattice points in case of two dimension, and these are the lattice points in case of three dimension. Okay. In the next slide, let us see lattice points and atoms. Few important points regarding lattice point and atoms. First thing, that we should not mix up atoms with lattice points. That is, atoms and lattice points are different. Number two, lattice points are a purely mathematical concept, whereas atoms are physical concepts. Lattice points may be used to represent atoms, but not exactly. We cannot consider the lattice points represent atoms. That is, we shouldn't mix up lattice point with atoms in case of solid structure. Third one, the lattice points do not necessarily lie at the center of atoms. We should not think that lattice points indicate the center of the atom. In a crystal structure, we should not think that lattice points do not represent the center of the atoms. Okay. Next you see unit cell. Unit cell, it is the basic structural unit of a crystal structure. Its geometry and atomic positions define the crystal structure. So for different solids, unit cell may be different. Here we are observing a three-dimensional cubical structure here. A unit cell is the smallest part of the crystal lattice, which when repeated in all three directions reproduces the lattice. So in case of three dimension, you see this is the unit cell, and if we repeat this unit cell throughout the crystal, we obtain the crystal, whole crystal. This is the smallest part of the whole crystal lattice. So a unit cell is very important. To describe the structure of the crystal, we must know the properties of the unit cell. Here we see the structure of the unit cell. This is the atomic arrangement of a solid, and unit cell is represented here. And unit cell covers few atoms within it, and few atoms as part of few atoms at the corners here. Okay, this unit cell is repeated and extended throughout the crystal. Unit cell vectors. There are some important parameters in case of unit cell vectors. First of all, it is the lattice parameters. A, B, C axis, axial lengths. We have here x, y, z, interaxial angles alpha, beta, gamma, and unit vectors A vector, B vector, and C vector. So the alpha is the angle between y-axis and z-axis, beta is the angle between z-axis and x-axis, and gamma is the angle between x-axis and y-axis. So all these parameters are very important to describe a unit cell. Types of unit cell. We may have basically we can find four different types of unit cell. A unit cell is the smallest component of the crystal that reproduces the whole crystal when stacked together with purely translational repetition. The first of all, we see the primitive unit cell. In this case, lattice point, we have only one lattice point. Okay. In the first figure, you see primitive cell here. Definitely, there are four in the upper side and four in the lower side. That is 8 lattice points are connected by this unit cell. But here the one lattice point at the corner shares with another 7 unit cells. That is, one lattice point is shared by 8 unit cells. That is why the 1 by 8 part of this lattice point is included within this cell. That is why 1 by 8 into 8, because it consists of 8 lattice points at the 8 corners. So we can have 1 by 8 into 8, that is 1, which is equal to 1. Only one lattice point is described by this unit cell. That is why it is called primitive cell. On the other hand, body centered. So in this case, one cell is contained in the body, center of the body of the unit cell. This is internal unit cell. And third one, face centered. This cubic structure has 6 faces. All faces contains lattice point at the center. Okay. Besides 8 lattice points on the 8 corners, it has 6 another lattice points on its faces. This is the face centered unit cell. And the third one, it has side lattice points. It has 2 lattice points on the 2 sides of the unit cell. So in this way, you can have 4 different basic types of unit cells. Primitive cell. A primitive cell is a unit cell that contains exactly one and only one lattice point. For a unit cell, generally, lattice points that are shared by n cells are counted as 1 by n of the lattice points contained in each of these cells. So here, as already I have discussed here, the one unit cell, suppose one lattice point, it is shared by 8 another 8 unit cells. That is n cells. This lattice point is shared by 8 cells. So 1 by 8. For example, a primitive unit cell in 3 dimensions which has lattice points only at its 8 vertices is considered to contain 1 by 8 of each of them. An alternative conceptualization is to be consistently pick only one of the n primitive unit cell in 3 dimensions which has lattice points only at its 8 vertices is considered to contain 1 by 8 of each of them. That is, again we see the definition. A primitive cell is a unit cell that contains exactly one and only one lattice point. So, though we have observed 8 lattice points, but actually this unit cell contains one lattice point. Okay, that is, each lattice point is shared by only 1 by 8. Okay. In the next slide, we see some primitive translation vectors A, B, and C span a lattice cell of smallest volume for a particular 3-dimensional lattice and are used to define a crystal translational vector. To describe the lattice structure, we are in need of this translational vector where A, B, and C, that is A vector, B vector, and C vector, are called translation vectors, and n1, n2, n3 are the integers. So this is required to describe a lattice structure. Since the primitive cell is defined by the primitive axis, that is A vector, B vector, and C vectors, the most smallest vectors, the volume of the primitive cell is given by the parallelepiped as the VP, that is volume, is equal to modulus of A vector dot B cross C. So this is the mathematical representation of volume of a primitive cell. Primitive translation vectors, lattice points of a space lattice in 2 dimensions are observed in the first figure. All pairs of vectors A1, A2 are translation vectors of the lattice, but A1 triple dash and A2 triple dash, this is A2 triple dash and this is A1 triple dash, are not primitive translation vector. Why? Because as you observed it, figure 1, 2 and 3, the areas are equal. All the areas are equal in case of figure 1, 2 and 3. So these pairs of translation vectors may be considered as primitive translation lattice vectors. Sometimes this is called lattice constant also, but this cannot be considered as translation vector because this area is bigger than any areas out of 1, 2 and 3. Similarly, you can also find out three-dimensional array. In case of three-dimensional also, we can use primitive translation vectors to describe the whole structure. Thank you, students. In my next class, I will discuss about some types of few different types of lattice structure. Thank you.